The gentle breeze carried the sound of an acoustic guitar through the narrow streets of Millbrook, a quaint town nestled in the rolling hills of the English countryside. Inside his modest bedroom, Oliver Bennett's fingers danced across the strings, his voice rising and falling with the melody of an original song he'd been perfecting for weeks. The setting sun cast long shadows through his window, illuminating the countless musical posters that covered his walls, a stark contrast to the accounting textbooks his father kept leaving on his desk. At 22, Oliver possessed the kind of voice that made people stop and listen, raw talent that needed only the right opportunity to shine. His dark curly hair fell over his eyes as he leaned into the music, lost in the moment, until a sharp knock at his door brought him back to reality. "Ollie, dinner's ready," his mother's warm voice called out, "and Marcus is here to see you." Oliver's fingers stilled on the strings as he heard his best friend's familiar footsteps ascending the stairs. Marcus Williams had been his closest friend since primary school, though lately their paths had begun to diverge. While Oliver chased his musical dreams, Marcus had embraced a more conventional route, pursuing a business degree at a prestigious university. Still at it with the guitar mate, Marcus appeared in the doorway, his pressed shirt and perfectly styled hair a stark contrast to Oliver's casual attire. "You know, there's an internship opening at my father's firm. Proper career, proper money, something to think about." Oliver carefully placed his guitar in its stand. "Not everyone dreams of spreadsheets and board meetings, Marcus." He tried to keep his tone light, but there was an edge to his words. "Besides, I've got that talent show coming up at the Riverside Theatre next weekend. Could be my big break." Marcus's laugh held a hint of condescension. "Big break in Millbrook? Come on, Ollie, we're not in London. The biggest audience you'll get here is Mrs. Patterson and her garden club." Before Oliver could respond, his father's voice boomed from downstairs. "Oliver, the dinner's getting cold, and I've got those accounting certification forms we need to discuss." The two friends shared a look. Marcus's triumphant, Oliver's resigned. As they headed downstairs, the familiar scent of his mother's shepherd's pie wafted up to meet them. In the modest dining room, Eleanor Bennett was setting the table, her kind eyes crinkling with warmth as she saw the boys. Thomas Bennett, Oliver's father, sat at the head of the table, a stack of papers beside his plate. "Marcus, good to see you, son." Thomas nodded approvingly. "How's university treating you? Still top of your class, I expect?" "Yes, sir," Marcus beamed. "Just finished an impressive project on investment banking. Professor thinks I might have a future in hedge fund management." Thomas's chest swelled with second-hand pride. "Now that's what I call ambition, Oliver, you see? That's the kind of direction you need in life." Eleanor placed a gentle hand on her husband's arm. "Thomas, please, not at dinner." The tension around the table was palpable as they began to eat. Oliver pushed his food around his plate, his appetite diminished by the familiar weight of disappointment in his father's eyes. The conversation drifted to Marcus's latest achievements, each word feeling like another brick in the wall between Oliver and his dreams. After dinner, back in his room, Oliver pulled out his notebook, filled with lyrics and musical notations. The talent show at the Riverside Theatre wasn't just another performance. It was his chance to prove everyone wrong. Local music promoters often attended these shows, searching for fresh talent. If he could just get noticed. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah, his younger sister away at university. "Don't let them dim your light, big brother. Your music matters." Oliver smiled, touching the small pendant around his neck, a guitar pick his grandmother had given him before she passed, telling him to always follow his heart. As night fell over Millbrook, he returned to his guitar, the melody flowing from his fingers, holding all the dreams his words couldn't express. In the quiet darkness, Oliver made a promise to himself. The talent show wouldn't just be another performance, it would be the beginning of something bigger. He had to believe that, even if no one else did. Because sometimes the hardest part of following your dreams isn't the obstacles others put in your path. It's fighting the doubt they plant in your heart. As he finally drifted off to sleep, his guitar standing sentinel in the corner, Oliver couldn't know that the coming weeks would test not just his talent, but everything he believed about friendship, family, and the true meaning of success. The Riverside Theatre stood as a Victorian jewel in Millbrook's crown, its red brick facade and ornate windows speaking of grander days when touring companies would bring London's finest shows to the countryside. Now on a crisp Saturday evening, it hosted the annual Millbrook Talent Showcase, and backstage Oliver's hands trembled as he tuned his guitar. Through a gap in the heavy velvet curtains, he could see the audience filing in. His mother sat in the third row, her encouraging smile visible even from a distance. The seat beside her remained empty. His father had claimed an urgent meeting at work, though Oliver knew better. Sarah had sent a good luck message from university, complete with virtual hugs and far too many emojis. "Nervous, mate?" Marcus's voice cut through Oliver's concentration. His friend leaned against the wall, scrolling through his phone. "You know, it's not too late to back out. Save yourself the embarrassment." Oliver tightened a string with more force than necessary. "Why are you even here, Marcus? Don't you have some important business networking event to attend? And miss my best friend's last hurrah before he finally grows up? Wouldn't dream of it." Marcus's words carried a familiar sting wrapped in casual cruelty. Before Oliver could respond, the stage manager appeared. "5 minutes, Mr. Bennett, you're up after the juggling act." The next few minutes passed in a blur. Oliver watched as a young girl finished her ballet routine, followed by an elderly man who juggled bowling pins with surprising agility. Then, suddenly, it was his turn. The spotlight felt hotter than he'd expected as he walked to the center of the stage. The audience was a sea of shadowy faces, but he could make out his mother's encouraging nod. Taking a deep breath, Oliver began to play. The first few notes rang clear and true, his fingers finding their familiar places on the fretboard. But as he opened his mouth to sing, something went wrong. His voice, usually strong and confident, emerged thin and shaky. The microphone picked up every tremor, every uncertain note. From the wings, Marcus watched with a mixture of pity and satisfaction. In the audience, Eleanor Bennett's smile never wavered, though her hands clasped tightly in her lap. And somewhere in the middle of the second verse, Oliver's voice cracked on a high note, the sound echoing through the theater like a gunshot. A few scattered coughs broke the silence. Someone in the back row whispered loudly. Oliver forced himself to continue, but the magic was gone. His original song, which had sounded so perfect in his bedroom, now felt amateur and exposed. When he finally struck the last chord, the applause was polite but brief, the kind reserved for participants rather than performers. Backstage, Oliver's hands shook as he packed away his guitar. The rest of the show continued beyond the curtain, but he barely heard it. Marcus appeared beside him, phone still in hand. "Look, Ollie, maybe this is for the best. You had your moment, you tried, and now you can focus on real opportunities." My father's firm... "Stop." Oliver's voice was quiet but firm. "Just stop, Marcus. I don't need your pity or your father's job offers." Later that night, Oliver sat on his bed, his grandmother's guitar pick spinning between his fingers. His phone buzzed repeatedly, messages from Sarah asking how it went, from his mother offering comfort, from Marcus sending links to job postings. He ignored them all. Instead, he opened his laptop and began searching. London, Manchester, Edinburgh. Cities where music lived in the streets, where dreams didn't feel quite so impossible. His savings account wasn't much. 6 months of working at the local pub had given him enough for a start, barely. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Eleanor entered, carrying a cup of tea and something else. An envelope. "I've been saving this," she said, placing both on his desk. "It's not much, but it might help. Whatever you decide, love, know that I believe in you." Oliver opened the envelope to find several £100 and a note. "For when you're ready to fly." His mother's neat handwriting blurred as his eyes welled with tears. "Dad will never forgive me if I leave," he whispered. Eleanor sat beside him, her hand finding his shoulder. "Your father loves you, Ollie. He's just forgotten what it's like to have a dream that scares you. Sometimes the hardest choices are the ones we have to make alone." As midnight approached, Oliver made his decision. The talent show hadn't been his last performance. It had been his last compromise. London was calling, and this time he would answer. He began to pack, his movements deliberate and quiet in the darkness. Tomorrow would bring arguments and disappointment, but it would also bring possibility. As he carefully placed his guitar in its case, Oliver realized that sometimes failure isn't an end. It's the push we need to begin again, somewhere new, where the weight of others' expectations doesn't hang quite so heavy. The morning light painted London's skyline in shades of grey and gold as Oliver emerged from King's Cross Station, guitar case in one hand, duffel bag in the other. The city's enormity struck him immediately, a far cry from Millbrook's quiet streets. Double-decker buses roared past, while waves of commuters rushed by, each locked in their own personal bubble of determination. His departure from home still rang in his ears. His father's thunderous silence, his mother's tear-stained smile, and Marcus's mocking "good luck with that, mate," had formed the soundtrack to his leaving. Only Sarah had sent an enthusiastic message. "Show them what you're made of, Ollie." The flat he'd managed to secure online was in Brixton, not exactly the glamorous London address he'd dreamed of, but what his budget allowed. After an awkward tube journey, where his guitar case earned him several annoyed glares, Oliver found himself standing before a weathered Victorian building converted into bedsits. His landlady, Mrs. Patel, was a tiny woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. "Musicians," she sighed, looking him up and down. "Always musicians. Ground rules. No practicing after 9, no parties, and rent's due first of every month. No exceptions." The bedsit itself was smaller than his bedroom at home. A single bed occupied one corner, a minimal kitchenette another, and a shared bathroom waited down the hall. But the window offered a slice of London sky, and for Oliver, that view held infinite possibilities. He spent that first day walking the streets of his new neighborhood, guitar strapped to his back. Brixton's energy was infectious. Street vendors calling out their wares, music spilling from shop doorways, the scent of a dozen different cuisines mingling in the air. He found himself outside the Brixton Academy, studying the posters of upcoming shows, imagining his name there one day. Reality hit hard when he started visiting music venues. The first 3 places didn't even let him audition. "We've got a 6-month waiting list for slots," one board manager told him, "and that's for established acts." At the 4th pub, the Black Swan, he finally got his chance. The owner, Mike, a burly man with tattoo-covered arms, listened to him play one song in the empty bar during afternoon cleanup. "You're not bad, kid," Mike said, wiping a glass, "but you're not ready. Your timing's off, and your stage presence needs work. Come back in a few months if you've improved." Oliver spent the evening in his bedsit, practicing until Mrs. Patel banged on his door at exactly 9 o'clock. He'd known it wouldn't be easy, but the reality of London's competitive music scene was proving harsher than expected. The next few weeks fell into a routine. Mornings were spent working at a coffee shop near Leicester Square, a job he'd fortunately secured through one of his few London contacts, his cousin's former roommate. Afternoons were dedicated to practicing and writing new songs, and evenings were spent either performing at open mic nights or watching other musicians, studying their techniques. The open mic nights were an education in themselves. Oliver watched singers far more polished than himself struggle to hold the audience's attention. He saw raw talents who commanded the room with nothing but passion and 3 chords. Each performance taught him something new about what worked and what didn't. His own performances were met with varying degrees of indifference. Some nights he'd get scattered applause. Others, he'd barely be heard over the chatter of pub patrons more interested in their conversations than his music. One particularly discouraging evening, after a performance where the sound system had mangled his careful guitar work into distorted noise, Oliver found himself sitting on the edge of his bed, phone in hand, thumb hovering over his father's number. The responsible thing would be to admit defeat, return home, take that job at Marcus's father's firm. Instead, he called his mother. "The city's so big, Mum," he confessed, his voice small in the empty room. "Everyone here is so talented, so polished. Maybe I was naive to think—" "Oliver Bennett," Eleanor's voice cut through his doubt. "Do you remember what Grandma used to say about butterflies?" Despite himself, Oliver smiled. "That they don't become beautiful by being comfortable in their cocoons." "Exactly. London's your cocoon right now, love. Give yourself time to grow into your wings." After hanging up, Oliver pulled out his notebook and began to write. The city's rhythm had been seeping into his music, changing it. His songs were different now, less naive perhaps, but more honest. The struggle, the loneliness, the determination, it was all there in the lyrics, flowing from his pen. As midnight approached, the sounds of London filtered through his window, distant sirens, late-night revelers, the last tube rumbling beneath the streets. Oliver played softly, mindful of Mrs. Patel's rules, working on a new song that had been forming in his mind. It was about transformation, about the space between who you are and who you want to be. Tomorrow would bring more rejections, more indifferent audiences, more moments of doubt. But tonight, in the quiet of his small room, Oliver felt something shifting. London wasn't just a place anymore. It was becoming part of his story, weaving itself into his music, teaching him lessons that couldn't be learned in the comfort of home. 3 months into his London adventure, Oliver was beginning to understand the true cost of chasing dreams. His savings had dwindled alarmingly, and the coffee shop wages barely covered his rent and the cheapest groceries he could find. But it was a chance encounter on a rainy Tuesday that would change everything. He was performing at The Basement, a tiny venue in Camden that actually paid its open mic performers £5 and a free drink. The audience was sparse, typical for a weeknight, but Oliver had learned to play as if the room was packed. His new song, the one born from lonely London nights, seemed to resonate differently this evening. As he finished his set, a man approached the small stage. James Harrison had the kind of presence that commanded attention: expertly tailored suit, silver-streaked hair, and keen eyes that seemed to look straight through you. He waited until Oliver had packed up his guitar before speaking. "You've got something interesting there," Harrison said, extending a business card. "Rough around the edges, but interesting. I'm having a small gathering at my studio next week. Come play for people who might actually be listening." Oliver stared at the card. Harrison Music Management embossed in simple black letters. His heart raced, but years of watching Marcus's calculating behavior had taught him caution. "Why me?" he asked. "There are hundreds of better musicians in London." Harrison's laugh was genuine. "Talent isn't just about technical perfection. It's about authenticity. Your last song, it was real. That's rarer than you might think." He checked his expensive watch. "Tuesday, 7 p.m. The address is on the card. Don't be late." The week crawled by. Oliver spent every free moment practicing, refining his songs, trying to decide which ones to play. His mother was cautiously excited when he called to tell her, while Sarah bombarded him with texts demanding updates. The studio turned out to be a converted warehouse in Shoreditch, all exposed brick and industrial chic. Inside, about 20 people mingled, drinking wine and engaging in the kind of industry chat that made Oliver feel hopelessly provincial. Harrison appeared at his elbow. "Nervous?" "Terrified," Oliver admitted. "Good, use it." Harrison guided him to a small stage area. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, this is Oliver Bennett, and he has something to share with us." The room fell silent. Oliver's fingers found their place on the strings, and he began to play. This time he closed his eyes, shutting out the watching faces, focusing only on the story he wanted to tell through his music. When he finished, the silence lasted a heartbeat too long. Then the applause started. Genuine, enthusiastic applause. People were smiling, nodding, leaning in to whisper to each other. "Well," Harrison said later, as the gathering wound down, "I think we can work with this. How would you feel about proper management? Studio time, professional development, the works?" Oliver's heart leaped, but again caution prevailed. "What's the catch?" "Smart boy." Harrison smiled approvingly. "The catch is, it's hard work. Really hard work. I'll help you develop your talent, but you'll need to trust my guidance. Think you can handle that?" As Oliver walked home that night, the city seemed different. The same streets, the same buildings, but everything felt charged with possibility. He called his mother from the tube station, her joy palpable even through the patchy underground signal. Back in his bedsit, he found an email from Marcus. "Heard you're still playing in pubs. Dad's offer still stands when you're ready to grow up." Oliver started to type an angry response, then stopped. Instead, he opened his notebook and began working on a new song. Success would be the best reply to doubt. The next morning, he met Harrison at a small cafe near the studio. As they discussed contracts and plans, Oliver felt a strange mix of excitement and terror. This was real. This was happening. "One more thing," Harrison said as they were finishing. "I need to travel to Manchester next month. My mother isn't well, and I'll be helping her recover from surgery. It'll be about 3 weeks. Think you can handle things here on your own for a while?" Oliver nodded, not realizing that this brief conversation would later prove crucial. For now he was focused on the stack of papers before him, his first professional music contract. As he signed his name, he thought of his father's accounting forms, still sitting untouched on his desk back home. Sometimes the right path isn't the one others choose for you, but the one you brave alone until someone finally sees what you've always known was there. The first 2 weeks after Harrison's departure had been promising. Oliver's schedule was packed with studio sessions, meetings with producers, and small performances at increasingly reputable venues. His new single was taking shape, and there was even talk of a small UK tour in the autumn. But then came the contract from Stella Records. It arrived on a Wednesday morning, delivered by a courier to the studio. The document was thick with legal terminology that made Oliver's head spin. Harrison had always handled the business side of things, breaking down the complex terms into understandable pieces. Now Oliver found himself alone with a decision that could make or break his career. The offer seemed incredible: a 3-album deal, significant advance payment, and promotional support. The catch: they wanted an answer within 48 hours, and Harrison was unreachable in Manchester, dealing with his mother's complicated recovery. Oliver spent that night in his bedsit, papers spread across his bed, trying to make sense of the contract's dense language. His mother's voice echoed in his head. Sometimes the best opportunities come at the worst times. But so did his father's. Never sign anything you don't fully understand. In desperation, he called the only person he knew with business experience, Marcus. A record deal? You're actually serious about this music thing, aren't you? Marcus's familiar condescension crackled through the phone. Send it over. I'll have a look. An hour later, Marcus called back. Look, mate, I've only done a basic review, but it seems legitimate. The advance alone would set you up nicely. I'd sign it if I were you. The next morning, running on caffeine and nervous energy, Oliver made his decision. He signed the contract, hands shaking slightly as he penned his signature on each marked page. The Stella Records executive who collected it smiled broadly, promising big things to come. It took less than a week for everything to unravel. First came the emails from Harrison's lawyer. The contract with Stella violated his existing management agreement. Then came the demands. The advance would need to be repaid, and there were potential penalties for breach of contract. Oliver's stomach churned as he read through the implications. The advance money, which he'd already used to move to a better flat and buy new equipment, would need to be returned. The penalties could bankrupt him before his career even properly began. In his new flat, surrounded by unopened boxes and the shiny new guitar he'd bought with money he now owed, Oliver finally broke down. He'd made a mess of everything, and for the first time since arriving in London, he felt completely lost. His phone buzzed, a message from his mother. "Everything all right, love? You've been quiet lately." Oliver stared at the message, tears blurring his vision. How could he tell her that he'd ruined everything, that her faith in him had been misplaced? A knock at the door startled him. It was his landlord, wondering about the rent that was now 2 weeks overdue. Oliver promised it would be sorted soon, knowing he was adding another lie to his growing pile of problems. That evening, he sat in his favorite spot by the Thames, watching the sunset paint the city in deceptively peaceful hues. His guitar lay in its case beside him, untouched. For the first time since he'd learned to play, music offered no comfort. His phone rang again. Marcus this time. "Hey, how's that record deal working out?" Oliver's silence was answer enough. "Look," Marcus's voice softened slightly. "Everyone makes mistakes. That's why sensible people stick to safe choices. Dad's firm is always looking for—" "I have to go," Oliver cut him off, ending the call. Walking back to his flat, Oliver passed by the Brixton Academy. The posters that had once inspired him now seemed to mock his failures. He'd come to London with such big dreams, and now, in his flat, he began to pack, his movements mechanical. The new guitar went into its case first. He'd have to sell it to help repay the advance. His notebooks full of lyrics followed, then his clothes. With each item, the weight of his failure grew heavier. The last thing he packed was his grandmother's guitar pick, the one that had always given him courage. Now it felt like a reminder of his naivety. As he placed it in his pocket, his phone buzzed one final time. A message from Harrison. "Back in London tomorrow. We need to talk." But Oliver had already made his decision. He couldn't face Harrison, couldn't bear to see the disappointment in yet another person's eyes. By morning, he'd be on a train back to Millbrook, back to the life he'd tried so hard to escape. Sometimes, he realized, the hardest part of having a dream isn't the struggle to achieve it. It's knowing when you've lost the right to keep trying. The train journey back to Millbrook felt longer than it had 3 months ago. Each mile marked a retreat, each station a reminder of the distance between dreams and reality. Oliver sat with his guitar case propped against the window, shielding him from the curious glances of other passengers. He hadn't told anyone he was coming home. His phone lay silent in his pocket, Harrison's unread messages piling up alongside concerned texts from his mother. The only person he'd contacted was Mrs. Patel, apologizing for leaving without notice and promising to send his final rent payment as soon as he could. Millbrook Station looked exactly the same peeling paint, the same creaking bench where he'd waited for the London train all those months ago. But Oliver felt like a different person, stepping onto the familiar platform. The walk home gave him time to rehearse explanations, excuses, anything to make his failure sound less complete. But when he turned onto his street and saw his childhood home, words failed him entirely. Eleanor Bennett was in the garden when he arrived, pruning her beloved roses. She looked up at the sound of his footsteps, and her secateurs clattered to the ground. "Oliver?" She rushed to embrace him, then pulled back to study his face. "What's happened, love?" Before he could answer, Thomas Bennett appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable. The sight of his father made Oliver's chest tighten with shame. "I made a mistake," Oliver managed, his voice barely a whisper. Several mistakes, actually. What followed was possibly the longest dinner of Oliver's life. He told them everything: the contract, the advance, the legal implications. His father remained silent throughout, while his mother reached across the table to squeeze his hand supportively. "Well," Thomas finally said, pushing back from the table, "I suppose we should be grateful you've learned this lesson relatively cheaply. I'll make some calls tomorrow, see about that position at Williams & Sons." "Thomas," Eleanor interrupted sharply, "perhaps we could save the career planning for another day." Later that evening, as Oliver unpacked in his old room, he found himself staring at the familiar posters on the walls. They seemed to belong to a different person now, someone more innocent, more hopeful. A soft knock at his door revealed Sarah, home from university for the weekend. "Mum called," she explained, wrapping him in a fierce hug. "Why didn't you tell us things were going wrong?" Oliver sank onto his bed, suddenly exhausted. "I thought I could handle it. I thought if I just worked harder, believed more." "Believed more in what?" Marcus's voice came from the doorway, making them both jump. "In fairy tales about making it big in London." Sarah stood up, hands on her hips. "Nobody invited you, Marcus. Actually, your mum did. She thought Oliver might need a friend." Marcus stepped into the room, his usual polish somewhat diminished. "Although I suppose I haven't been much of one lately." An uncomfortable silence filled the room. Sarah looked between them, then tactfully excused herself, closing the door behind her. "Look," Marcus began, uncharacteristically hesitant, "about that contract. I should have told you to wait for Harrison. I got caught up in acting like I knew what I was talking about, and—" "It's not your fault," Oliver interrupted. "I made the decision. I have to live with it." Marcus sat in Oliver's desk chair, spinning slightly. "Funny thing is, I always envied you a bit." "You? Envied me?" Oliver couldn't hide his disbelief. "You knew what you wanted. Really wanted, I mean. Not just what everyone expected you to want." Marcus stared at his expensive shoes. "Do you know why I really came to check on you tonight? I've been lying to everyone about university. I haven't attended a class in months." The revelation hung in the air between them, reshaping everything Oliver thought he knew about his oldest friend. Before he could respond, his phone buzzed. Another message from Harrison. This time he opened it. "Your mother called. We need to talk about solutions, not problems. Call me." Oliver stared at the message, then at Marcus, who looked more vulnerable than he'd ever seen him. Perhaps coming home wasn't an ending after all, but a different kind of beginning, one where masks could fall and truth could finally break through. Sometimes failure teaches us more than success ever could, not just about ourselves, but about the people we thought we knew so well. The morning after his return to Millbrook dawned with unexpected clarity. Oliver sat in the garden nursing a cup of tea when his phone rang. Harrison's name flashed on the screen, and this time Oliver answered. 3 weeks of avoiding my calls," Harrison's voice was calm but firm. "Care to explain?" Oliver took a deep breath. "I messed up. I know I messed up. The contract, the advance—" "Yes, you did mess up," Harrison interrupted. But do you know what your biggest mistake was? Running away instead of facing it. The words stung with truth. I didn't know how to fix it. That's why you have a manager, Oliver. These things happen in the industry. Contracts, legal issues, financial problems. They're speed bumps, not roadblocks. Unless, of course, you choose to abandon your car at the first bump. Hope flickered in Oliver's chest for the first time in weeks. Can it be fixed? I've already started negotiations with Stella. They're not happy, but they're willing to discuss terms for releasing you from the contract. It'll cost you all of the advance plus a penalty, but it's not insurmountable. Oliver glanced at the new guitar case propped against his bedroom wall. I can sell the equipment I bought. Keep the guitar, Harrison said firmly. You'll need it, because once this is sorted, we're going to do things properly this time. No shortcuts. After hanging up, Oliver felt lighter than he had in weeks. The problem wasn't solved, but at least it wasn't crushing him anymore. His contemplation was interrupted by the sight of Marcus walking up the garden path, looking uncharacteristically disheveled. Your mum said you'd be out here, Marcus said, dropping onto the bench beside him. I think I need to talk to someone who knows what it's like to disappoint everyone. Over the next hour, Marcus's carefully constructed facade crumbled completely. He hadn't just stopped attending university. He'd been struggling with severe anxiety and depression, hiding it behind a mask of success and superiority. Everyone had such expectations, Marcus explained, staring at his hands. Top grades, perfect career, following in Dad's footsteps. I tried, I really did. But one day I just couldn't get out of bed. Couldn't face another lecture about investment strategies when all I really wanted... What did you want? Oliver asked softly. Marcus laughed bitterly. That's the worst part. I don't even know. I just know it wasn't that. Oliver thought about all the times Marcus had mocked his dreams, wondering now if that criticism had come from a place of envy, not of the music itself, but of the courage to choose one's own path. Have you told your parents? Marcus shook his head. How can I? Dad's already printed business cards for me at the firm. Marcus Williams, junior investment analyst. He carries them around, showing them off. They need to know, Oliver said. Trust me, the longer you carry this alone, the heavier it gets. As if on cue, Eleanor appeared with more tea and her signature chocolate biscuits. She took one look at Marcus's face and sat down with them. You know, she said, arranging biscuits on a plate. When Oliver was little, he used to hide whenever he was upset. It took me years to teach him that sharing your troubles doesn't make them bigger. It makes you stronger. Marcus accepted a biscuit with trembling hands. Mrs. Bennet, how did you feel when Oliver chose music over a stable career? Scared, she admitted, but proud too, because he was brave enough to be honest about who he is and what he wants. She turned to Marcus with motherly concern. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is admit we're lost. That evening, Oliver received another call from Harrison, outlining the next steps for resolving the Stella Records situation. But his mind was partially elsewhere, thinking about Marcus and the strange turns life could take. He picked up his guitar, the one Harrison had told him to keep, and began to play softly. A new melody was forming in his mind, something about masks and expectations, about the courage it takes to be vulnerable. Sarah, home for the weekend, appeared in his doorway. That's new, she said, sitting cross-legged on his bed. It's different from your other songs. Everything's different now, Oliver replied, still playing. I thought coming home was giving up, but maybe it's just giving me a better story to tell. As night fell over Millbrook, two young men in different houses faced similar challenges. Learning that strength sometimes means admitting weakness, that success isn't always what others define it to be, and that the hardest truths often lead to the most important changes. The following weeks in Millbrook took on an unexpected rhythm. Mornings were spent with Harrison via video calls, untangling the legal mess with Stella Records. Afternoons found Oliver working at his father's office, not as an accountant, but as a temporary file clerk, earning money to repay the advance. Thomas Bennet had surprised everyone by offering the position. Not permanent, he'd said gruffly, just until you sort things out, and no office parties expecting musical entertainment. The real surprise, however, came from Marcus's parents. The Williams family had always been Millbrook's example of perfect success, their reputation as carefully maintained as their Georgian house's facade. So when Marcus finally told them the truth about university, The town expected a scandal. Instead, they got a lesson in love's quiet strength. Dad cried, Marcus told Oliver during their lunch break. They'd taken to eating together in the small park between their offices. Actually cried. Said he'd had no idea how much pressure I was under. Mum's already found me a therapist in London. Oliver pulled out his sandwich, made by his mother, who still insisted on feeding him like a teenager. How does it feel? Being honest about everything. Terrifying, liberating, I don't know. Marcus picked at his own lunch. The weird thing is, for the first time in years, I'm sleeping through the night. Their conversation was interrupted by Oliver's phone. Harrison again. These calls had become the framework of Oliver's days, each one bringing him closer to resolving the Stella situation. Good news, Harrison announced without preamble. They've agreed to waive the penalty fee if you surrender the advance payment in full. Have you got it? Oliver looked at the envelope in his desk drawer. 3 weeks of filing, plus the sale of most of his new equipment, had finally yielded enough. Yes, it's ready. Good, because I've got something else to discuss. Remember that song you played at the showcase? The one about transformation? Of course. I played it for some people. Important people. They're interested, Oliver. Very interested. But this time, we do everything by the book. No rushed decisions, no shortcuts. Are you ready to try again? Oliver glanced at Marcus, who was pretending not to eavesdrop. Yes, but can we do it differently this time? I need to stay connected to why I started making music in the first place. Harrison's chuckle crackled through the phone. Wisdom from failure. I like it. Come to London next week. We'll start fresh. That evening, Oliver sat with his parents in the living room, explaining the new developments. Thomas Bennett listened silently, his expression thoughtful. This Harrison, he finally said, he stood by you even after the contract mistake? Yes. And he's willing to give you another chance? He is. Thomas nodded slowly. Then perhaps I should do the same. He cleared his throat. Your mother always said I was too harsh about your music. I was afraid you'd get hurt chasing dreams, but maybe the dream isn't the problem. Maybe it's about having the right people helping you chase it. Eleanor's eyes shimmered with tears as she watched her husband and son share a moment of understanding that had been years in the making. Later, in his room, Oliver pulled out his grandmother's guitar pick. Its familiar weight in his palm felt different now. Not just a symbol of dreams, but of resilience, of the courage to try again after failure. He began to play, soft and thoughtful. The melody that emerged wasn't about stardom or success. It was about home, about second chances, about the unexpected ways we find our path. Sarah appeared in his doorway, as she often did when he played. Another new one? Maybe, Oliver smiled. I'm learning that sometimes you have to get lost to find the right direction. Through his window, he could see Marcus's house. A light was on in Marcus's room, and Oliver could imagine his friend finally facing his own truth, finding his own path. Sometimes the greatest gift failure gives us is the wisdom to succeed differently, not just for ourselves, but for everyone whose story becomes intertwined with ours. The second time Oliver arrived in London, everything felt different. Instead of wide-eyed dreams and nervous energy, he carried with him a quiet determination. Harrison met him at the station, a subtle smile playing on his lips. "Welcome back," Harrison said, leading him to a waiting car. "Ready to do this properly?" The studio they drove to wasn't the trendy Shoreditch space Oliver remembered. Instead, it was a converted Victorian house in Greenwich, its walls lined with gold records and vintage instruments. A baby grand piano dominated the main room, its polished surface reflecting the afternoon light. "This is where we build careers," Harrison explained. "Not just chase hits. We take time here, do things right." Over the next few weeks, Oliver immersed himself in a different kind of musical education. Harrison had assembled a team of industry veterans, vocal coaches, songwriting mentors, performance specialists. Each day brought new lessons, not just in music, but in the business of making it. "Your voice has matured," his vocal coach noted during one session. "There's something deeper there now. Experience, perhaps." Oliver thought about the past months, the failures, the homecoming, the truths revealed. You could say that. His songwriting was evolving too. The raw talent that had caught Harrison's attention was being refined but not diminished. His new songs carried echoes of his journey, The struggle, the fall, the rising again. Back in Millbrook, changes were unfolding too. Marcus had started therapy, slowly uncovering who he was beneath years of expectations. Their daily phone calls had become a lifeline for both of them. "Dad's actually listening now," Marcus told him one evening. "Really listening. Yesterday we talked for hours about what I might want to do, not about the firm, just about me." "And? Any ideas?" "Maybe. There's this program in art therapy. Don't laugh, but I used to draw all the time as a kid, before everyone decided I was meant for finance." Oliver smiled, remembering the doodles that used to fill the margins of Marcus's school notebooks. "I never knew that." "Neither did I, really. Not until I started letting myself remember who I was, before I tried to become who everyone wanted me to be." The conversation stayed with Oliver as he worked on his new album. Harrison had connected him with a prestigious independent label, one known for developing artists rather than manufacturing stars. "They want authenticity," Harrison explained. "Show them what you showed me that first night at the basement, but better." The first single came together almost naturally. It was a song about masks falling away, about finding strength in vulnerability. Oliver thought of Marcus as he wrote it, of his father's gradual acceptance, of his own journey from naive ambition to grounded purpose. The recording process was different this time. No rushed deadlines, no pressure to compromise. Harrison sat in on every session, his experienced ear catching nuances Oliver was still learning to recognize. "This isn't just about making music," Harrison told him during a late-night mixing session. "It's about telling truth through music. That's what separates artists from entertainers." The single was released quietly. No major publicity campaign, no flashy promotions. Just the song, finding its way to the right ears at the right time. And somehow, it worked. Radio stations began picking it up. Music blogs started writing about the refreshing honesty in the lyrics. A prominent streaming platform featured it on their Ones to Watch playlist. Success, Oliver was learning, didn't always announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it crept in quietly, building slowly like a rising tide rather than crashing like a wave. Sarah was the first to send him a screenshot of his song on a major playlist. "Look who's trending," her message read, followed by about 50 exclamation marks. His mother called in tears after hearing his song on the local radio. "They played it right after that new Ed Sheeran track," she said proudly. "I told everyone in the shop it was my son." Even his father had something to say. "It's different from your old songs," he admitted during their weekly call. "More real somehow." Oliver sat in his new flat, modest but comfortable, paid for with legitimate earnings this time, and felt something he'd never experienced in his first London adventure: peace. His phone buzzed with a message from Marcus. "Just heard your song in a cafe. Nearly spilled my coffee. Proud of you, mate." Really proud. As night fell over London, Oliver picked up his guitar, the one Harrison had told him to keep, and began working on his next song. This one was about redemption, about the quiet courage it takes to begin again. Through his window, he could see the city lights twinkling like stars. The same view that had once seemed to mock his failures now felt like a gentle reminder. Sometimes, the long road is the right road. Success, he was learning, wasn't just about reaching the destination. It was about becoming the person worthy of the journey. 6 months after the release of his first legitimate single, Oliver found himself back in Millbrook. Not running away this time, but celebrating. His debut album had just been certified silver, an achievement that felt both surreal and somehow right. The Riverside Theatre, where his journey had begun with that disastrous talent show performance, was now hosting his hometown album launch. The irony wasn't lost on him. "Full house," Harrison remarked, peering through the curtains at the gathering crowd. "Quite a change from last time, eh?" Oliver adjusted his guitar strap, surprisingly calm. Different person, different story. The audience was a mix of locals and music industry people who'd made the journey from London. In the front row, Eleanor and Thomas Bennett sat proudly, his father actually wearing the tour t-shirt Sarah had insisted on buying him. Next to them was Marcus, looking relaxed in casual clothes, a far cry from the pressed suits he used to wear like armor. Before going on stage, Oliver received a text from his vocal coach. "Remember, your story is your strength. Let them feel it." The lights dimmed, and Oliver stepped into the spotlight. This time his voice didn't shake. This time he owned every note, every word, every moment. He opened with his hit single, the song about masks and truth that had launched his career. But it was his second song that caught everyone by surprise. A new composition, never performed before. "This is for someone who taught me that sometimes our biggest critics are fighting their own battles," he said, catching Marcus's eye in the audience. "And that true friendship means being there for each other's second chances." The song told the story of two friends, one chasing dreams, one trapped by expectations, and how they both had to fall apart to find their way back to authenticity. In the audience, Marcus wiped away tears, nodding in understanding. During the intermission, Harrison pulled Oliver aside. "The label called. They want to send you on a proper tour. Small venues, but across Europe. Think you're ready?" Oliver glanced at his family in the audience, his mother beaming, his father trying not to look too emotional, Sarah recording everything on her phone. Then at Marcus, who had finally found his path in art therapy, helping others express what they couldn't say in words. "Ready," Oliver nodded. "But can we schedule around Marcus's first art exhibition? He's promised to save me a piece." Harrison laughed. "You're different from most artists I've managed, you know that? Most would be pushing for bigger venues, faster releases, more exposure. I learned the hard way that faster isn't always better." The second half of the show felt like a celebration, not just of music but of transformation. Oliver performed songs from his album, each one telling part of his journey, the dreams, the failures, the comeback, the growth. For his final song, he invited Marcus on stage. "My best friend used to think my dreams were ridiculous," Oliver told the audience. "Now he helps others find their own dreams through art therapy. This song is about how we all have different paths to our truth." As they stood together under the spotlight, Oliver with his guitar, Marcus holding a small portfolio of his therapeutic art pieces, both felt the weight of their shared journey. They'd both fallen, both risen, both found their way to unexpected destinations. After the show, there was a small gathering at the Bennett's house. Thomas Bennett, to everyone's amazement, had arranged it himself. Industry people mingled with locals. Harrison chatted with Oliver's parents about the upcoming tour, and Sarah flitted about taking photos of everything. "Did you ever imagine this?" Marcus asked as they stood in the garden where they'd first shared their truths. "Any of this?" Oliver touched the guitar pick hanging from his neck, his grandmother's legacy of believing in dreams. "Not like this. This is better than what I imagined. It's real." Inside, he could hear his father proudly explaining the technical aspects of album certification to anyone who would listen. His mother was sharing embarrassing stories of his childhood performances with Harrison. The sound of their laughter, the warmth of their pride, the authenticity of the moment. It was worth every struggle, every setback, every lesson learned. Success, Oliver had discovered, wasn't a destination but a journey of becoming. And sometimes the most beautiful melodies are born from the notes we never expected to play. The European tour had been a whirlwind of small venues, passionate crowds, and growing recognition. Oliver's authentic storytelling through music had struck a chord with audiences across the continent. But it was a call from Marcus that brought the biggest surprise of the tour. "Remember how you always said I was hiding behind my father's expectations?" Marcus's voice crackled through the phone as Oliver sat in his Paris hotel room. "Well, I've just done something absolutely terrifying." Oliver set down his guitar. "What happened?" "I turned down the position at Dad's firm. Permanently. And I've been offered a position running art therapy programs at the new wellness center in London. They want me to develop a program combining financial counseling with creative therapy, using my background in both worlds." The pride in Marcus's voice was unmistakable. Oliver smiled, remembering their conversations in the garden months ago. "How did your father take it?" "That's the incredible part. He's helping me set up the program. Said something about how watching you follow your dreams taught him some lessons too." The conversation stayed with Oliver through his final performances in Europe. His music had evolved during the tour, gaining depth from the stories of people he'd met, lives he'd touched. Harrison had been right. Success wasn't just about making music, but about telling truth through music. Back in London, Oliver faced his own challenging decision. Major labels were starting to notice his success, offering contracts with impressive numbers and promises of international stardom. the kind of opportunities he'd once desperately wanted. "They're good offers," Harrison admitted during a strategy meeting. "Better than what we initially imagined. But remember why we started this journey." Oliver picked up his guitar, the same one Harrison had told him to keep during his darkest days. "I remember. It was never about being the biggest. It was about being real." The decision became clearer after a visit to Marcus's new wellness center. The walls were adorned with client artwork, each piece telling a story of healing and self-discovery. In one corner, Oliver recognized a familiar style, Marcus's own artwork, documenting his journey from expectation to authenticity. "Each person who comes here has their own song to sing," Marcus explained, showing Oliver around. "We just help them find their voice." Sound familiar? It was during this visit that Oliver got the call that would change everything again. A prestigious independent label, known for nurturing artists who prioritized authenticity over commercial success, wanted to discuss a partnership. "They're offering complete creative control," Harrison explained later. "Smaller advance, bigger artistic freedom. It's less money than the major labels, but more truth," Oliver finished. "When can we meet them?" The meeting took place in a converted chapel-turned recording studio. The label executives didn't talk about charts or sales projections. Instead, they discussed artistic vision, cultural impact, and the responsibility of authentic storytelling. "We've followed your journey," the label's creative director said, "from that first single about masks falling away to your latest European recordings. You're not just making music, you're documenting a generation's struggle with authenticity." As Oliver left the meeting, he passed a wall of albums the label had produced, artists who had chosen artistic integrity over commercial compromises. He could picture his own album there, telling its story of dreams, failures, and redemption. That evening, he called his parents to discuss the decision. His father, who once would have immediately asked about the financial implications, instead asked, "Which choice feels true to your story, son?" His mother, as always, put it perfectly. "Sometimes the biggest success is staying true to why you started." Later, in his flat, Oliver began writing a new song. It was about the choices we make when dreams start coming true, about how success tests our authenticity just as much as failure does. The melody came easily, born from all he'd learned, that true success isn't measured in sales figures or streaming numbers, but in the lives touched, the truths told, the authenticity maintained. Through his window, he could see the London skyline. The same view that had once seemed so intimidating now felt like home. His phone buzzed with a message from Marcus, sharing photos of his latest therapy sessions artwork. Two dreamers who had lost their way, now helping others find theirs, each in their own unique way. The symmetry wasn't lost on Oliver as he continued working on his song, his grandmother's guitar pick catching the light as it had so many times before. Sometimes the hardest choices are the ones that lead us back to ourselves. 1 year to the day after his disastrous first attempt at a London music career, Oliver stood on stage at the Royal Albert Hall. Not as a headliner, but as a special guest at a benefit concert for mental health awareness, an event organized in part by Marcus's Wellness Center. The circular hall was packed, its historic architecture amplifying not just the music, but the meaning behind it. In the audience sat everyone who had been part of his journey, his parents, Sarah, Harrison, and countless faces from Millbrook who had watched him grow from a dreamer into an artist. Oliver had chosen to perform his newest song, the one about choosing authenticity over easy success. As he stepped up to the microphone, he caught sight of Marcus in the front row, sitting beside his father. Both Williams' men looked different now, more relaxed, more genuine, more themselves. "This song is about choices," Oliver addressed the audience. "Not just the big ones like following your dreams, but the harder ones. Staying true to those dreams once they start coming true." The performance was being recorded for his second album with the independent label. They had given him exactly what they promised, complete creative control and the freedom to tell his stories his way. The resulting music wasn't topping the commercial charts, but it was reaching people in ways he'd never imagined. After the show at the reception, Oliver found himself surrounded by young musicians seeking advice. Their questions weren't about record deals or promotion strategies, but about staying authentic in an industry that often demanded compromise. "The trick," he told them, is remembering why you started. Success isn't about becoming someone else's version of you. It's about becoming the truest version of yourself. Marcus joined him, carrying his latest artwork, a piece commissioned for the Wellness Center's new building. It showed two paths, one straight and seemingly easy, the other winding but filled with color and life. Look familiar? Marcus grinned. A bit on the nose, isn't it? Oliver laughed. Sometimes people need to see their story reflected back at them. Marcus shrugged. Isn't that what your music does? Later that evening, Oliver's parents hosted a small gathering at their London flat, a recent purchase that Thomas Bennett described as investing in the future of family gatherings. The proud father had finally sold his accounting firm, choosing instead to help young entrepreneurs navigate the business world without losing themselves. Who would have thought? Thomas mused, watching Oliver and Marcus sharing stories with their guests. A musician and an art therapist, not exactly the future I imagined for either of you. Sometimes the best futures are the ones we couldn't imagine, Eleanor replied, squeezing her husband's hand. As the night wound down, Oliver found himself on the flat's small balcony, looking out over the city that had both broken and rebuilt him. Harrison joined him, holding 2 glasses of champagne. Your grandmother would be proud, Harrison said, handing Oliver a glass, not just of your success, but of how you achieved it. Oliver touched the guitar pick around his neck. I keep thinking about what she used to say about butterflies and cocoons, about how strength comes from the struggle. And what do you think now? I think it's not just about becoming who you're meant to be, Oliver replied. It's about helping others find the courage to do the same. Inside, he could hear Marcus explaining his therapy program to a group of interested investors. Sarah was showing their parents her university thesis, a documentary about young people choosing unconventional paths. The room was filled with the sound of authentic lives being lived. Oliver's new album would be released next month. It wasn't written to top charts or win awards, but to tell stories that needed telling, about dreams and failures, masks and truths, and the courage to choose authenticity over approval. As he looked around at the gathering, his family, both born and chosen, Oliver realized that success had turned out to be something very different from what he'd originally imagined. It wasn't about proving others wrong, but about proving yourself right. Not about becoming famous, but about becoming real. The melody of his life had found its true rhythm, and it was more beautiful than any song he could have written. Because sometimes the most powerful music isn't the kind that tops the charts. It's the kind that helps others find their own song to sing.